Welcome to Fridays on the Pagan Perspective. I'm Yucca, substituting for Feather. And this week we are talking about, we have some questions relating to an article or sort of a rant or blog that was written by an individual. And I'm going to put the link down below. If you haven't already read it from the previous host's videos, it's kind of a good idea to look through it. Might help understand a little bit what I'm talking about in this video. But the basic gist of it was that this individual was invited to, it sounded like a listserv, like an email list, and that was not their normal type of or branch of neo-paganism that they're really a part of. But since they were invited, they thought they'd check it out. They checked it out and found that there was a list that was being circulated in which it was one of those lists that had a list of things, which in this case were goddesses, and the association with them that you could use, like what color candle to burn or something like that. And they noticed, because their pantheon is the Aztec pantheon, that there was a mistake, and it was a pretty big mistake. It was listing a god as a goddess, and for them that was a really big deal, and it seemed like it was an indication of a lack of research or a lack of accurate information that they had gotten. Sort of the sense that I got, that was an indication of this. It was like that there wasn't a lot of respect involved with these particular deities. So when they sent in a response, they sent in and corrected the folks who made the list and said, hey, you made a mistake. And they received some pretty hostile responses to this. So they, it was frustrating for them, and they wrote an article, and there's a lot of things in this article that I personally can really relate to, them saying, having similar sorts of experiences. But before going any further, I want to just talk about, or kind of remember, that when reading articles or listening to someone or hearing someone, we're always hearing their perspective and their version. And that is, we're not hearing, at least in my opinion, we're not hearing truth with a capital T. And my household, I was raised with the belief, or the dicho, that there is no truth, only versions. And that was often reminded when people would tell stories of what happened. I'm the littler one, but my brother and I would have fights, and each of our version of what happened was significantly different than the other's version, even though we honestly believed what we were saying, because we were seeing it from a different perspective. Now, the moment you add in taking out the face-to-face communication, you put it into text, it makes it much more difficult, because not only are you dealing with the issues that people have of just bringing their own background to the story, you're also dealing with not having body language and not having tone of voice, and that's a huge amount of our communication. So the folks reading I actually checked through their website. I couldn't tell if they were, it didn't say whether they were male or female anywhere. I sort of got the sense from the style of writing that they were male, but I don't know. Anyways, I lost my train of thought. Here we go. I don't know what the way that they wrote in. They didn't give the actual communiques. They give some examples of what happened, but not the actual words that were used. But anyways, the question that our viewer asked for us, or there are two questions. First, what do we think about all of this, this topic? And is this something that we have personally experienced in the pagan community? So I want to preface this with, it is something that I think goes beyond just the pagan community. I think that it's a human thing. But what it is, let's step back and talk about what it is. There's several different issues kind of happening in here, and one of them I think was really well addressed by some of the previous hosts in terms of looking at the communication and communicating in a non-threatening way to each other. So I would definitely direct you towards Charlie's video on that and see what she had to say. So there's that element. There's the element of text communication. Now, I think that another issue that was going on is that, and this one particularly in pagan community, in New Age, and in issues that have to do with people's beliefs, it's really tied in with our identities and our self-identities. And it seemed like that list, that when this author challenged the accuracy of that list, there was a part that could be interpreted as challenging the author's identity, because their identity is very tied in with, probably very tied in with their perception of being a pagan and, feeling things out and all of that. And identities are really, first of all, they're very fragile, but they're something that we really try and protect and take care of, because it is the way that we relate to the world, the way that we perceive the world and interact with the world. And so when that's challenged, it's terrifying. And I don't really have any advice on how to deal with that, because, it's something that we all deal with, other than just to try and be conscious with ourselves of what is our identity and why is it. If it's not lining up with the reality, that's when it's really challenging. The most challenging is when someone points out that maybe what we think of ourselves is not maybe quite so true. Anyways, that to me looks like why that was so challenging, and I think that there's a lot of that happening in the pagan community, especially when it's something that people have come to recently or put a huge amount of their energy into, and their the way that they live. So now another issue, and this is the issue that's a little bit more sensitive for me, and one that I'm kind of cautious on trying to figure out quite how to communicate, but it seemed to me like it's also touched on the issue of people's respect, particularly eclectic types of pagans' respect towards other groups, towards other people's cultures, and the attitude of whether they have a right to use that or they don't have a right to it. When they do, what's respectful, what's not respectful. And it's a tricky one. It's one that I personally have very mixed feelings about, but it's one that I'm also kind of, it bugs me. It's one of those buttons that's pretty easy to push on me in terms of, particularly with the deities. Like, I kind of think, I'm like, well, why do you have the right to just go and take somebody's deity? Like, a deity is so part of the culture. It's their stories, it's their psyche. It's a very intimate and sacred thing. And I understand the argument of, well, if it works for you, then if you connect with it, great. And you can watch some of my past videos and see that I say, yeah, if you connect with it, then that's great. But there comes a point to you using it personally and you stealing it. That the line between appropriation and misappropriation is a very, well, I don't know. I think it moves. It depends on a lot of different circumstances. My general sense is that the kind of attitude that we said that we have a right to other cultures and other gods and other pantheons and other traditions really is inherited from that it belongs to us, this idea that, of course I should have access, it should be mine, I should have access to it, really comes from and is inherited from imperialism. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily, a terrible thing, well, a little bit, but it's something to be aware of. Because I really thought I had to spend a long time thinking about it, and so I guess I'm kind of rambling a little bit here, but it really comes, a big question that I think is really being looked at and kind of skirted around in this is, how much right do we have to somebody else's stuff, somebody else's culture, somebody else's traditions, someone else's stories? How much is it appropriate to share? And how much is this blatant disrespect and stealing? And I don't have those answers. I think that that's something that needs to be felt out and looked at on an individual basis. And it's difficult because you're going to be coming from different cultures and even cultures that we might think are the same cultures aren't always the same. There's differences. So it's tough. I mean, that balance between what works for you and what do you, and respecting someone else's privacy and someone else's sacredness. Um, so, yeah, I mean, what do you think about that? And let me know. Let us know. It's here. And I hope you guys are having a great week. We've got a real interesting topic coming up next week. So look forward to seeing you.